There's a particular smell that lives in old Canadian houses in November. Wood smoke and something baked, dried herbs hanging near a window, the particular cold that seeps through original single-pane glass that no one has gotten around to replacing because the house is already paid off, and there are more important things to spend money on. My grandmother's house in Sudbury smelled exactly like that. It smelled like 43 years of a woman who worked double shifts at the hospital laundry until her hands cracked in winter, who ate toast for dinner 3 nights a week so she could put a little more aside, who never once complained about any of it because she said complaining used energy better spent elsewhere. She passed when I was 24. She left me the house, not my mother, not my aunts. Me, because I was the one who drove up every other weekend during her last 2 years, who sat with her through the bad nights, who learned how to make her tea exactly the way she liked it, strong, with a splash of whole milk, never skim, never cream. She said I was the only one who got it right. I think she meant more than the tea. The deed was transferred in February, 8 months after the funeral. I remember the lawyer's office on Elm Street, the particular quality of winter light through those tall windows, the weight of the pen in my hand when I signed. My name, just mine. 26 years old, and I owned a house in full. No mortgage. No debt attached to it. Just a set of keys my grandmother had kept on a hook by the back door for as long as I could remember, now sitting in my coat pocket on the drive home. I moved in that spring. My husband, Joel, we'd been married 14 months by then, helped me carry boxes up the narrow staircase, and didn't complain once about the outdated bathroom or the kitchen that needed work. He stood in the living room the first night, looking at the wood-paneled walls and the braided rug my grandmother had made herself sometime in the 80s, and he said it felt like a place that had been waiting. I thought that was a beautiful thing to say. I wrote it in my journal. I genuinely believed, standing there, that I had married someone who understood the weight of things. I should tell you that I have no memory of a single moment in my marriage that felt as clear and as true as the ones I spent in that house before things went wrong. That's not hindsight. That's just what I know now in a way I didn't know then. The shift didn't announce itself. It rarely does. My mother-in-law had always been present in our lives in the way a low-grade headache is present. Not debilitating, not impossible to ignore, but always there at the edges, requiring management. She lived in Barrie, about 2 hours south, and she came to visit every 6 weeks or so. She was a woman who expressed love through commentary. The house needed new gutters. The curtains in the bedroom were the wrong color. The backyard could be so lovely if someone just put some effort into it. I learned to absorb these observations without reacting, which I understand now was probably the wrong approach. Absorbing things without reacting teaches certain people that absorption is infinite. It isn't. My brother-in-law was 22, living with a roommate in a rental in Hamilton that had become, according to my husband, increasingly untenable. The roommate was unreliable. The landlord was raising rent. He was between contracts, doing electrician work on and off, and he needed somewhere stable while he got back on his feet. My husband brought it up on a Thursday evening in March. We were cleaning up after dinner, and he said it casually, the way you say something you've been practicing saying casually. He said his brother needed a place to stay for a few months, just until he found something. Just the guest room. It wouldn't be long. I asked how long. He said probably until summer. I said I'd think about it. I want to be precise about what happened in my head over the following 2 days, because I think it matters. I did not immediately say no. I thought about it genuinely, the way you think about something when you actually intend to make a fair decision. My brother-in-law was family. The guest room existed. A few months was not forever. I turned it over from different angles. But then I called my grandmother's oldest friend, a woman named Doris who had been at the deed transfer and who knew my grandmother better than almost anyone alive, and I told her what was being proposed. And Doris said something that stopped me cold. She said, "Your grandmother left that house to you specifically because she knew you'd know how to hold on to it. Don't let anybody tell you holding on is the same thing as being selfish." I went back to my husband and I said I wasn't comfortable with it. Not yet. Not without more of a plan, a firm end date, an agreement about expenses, some structure around it. I wasn't saying no permanently. I was saying not like this. He said okay. He said he understood. He said he'd figure something else out. I believed him. That was the mistake I'll spend the longest time understanding. 6 weeks later, my mother-in-law called. Not my husband. Her. She called my cell phone on a Tuesday afternoon while I was on my lunch break at work. I was managing accounts for a construction firm downtown, and she told me, in a warm and practiced voice, that she had been thinking about the house. She said she had some concerns about me being up there alone when my husband traveled for work. She said a big house with just one person was a lot to manage. She said she'd been talking to my brother-in-law about it, and they both thought it would be good, actually good for everyone, if he came to stay, and she came on weekends sometimes to help out. I sat in my car in the parking garage and I let her finish. Then I said I'd speak to my husband about it. I drove back from that lunch break understanding something I hadn't understood before. The conversation with my husband in March had not ended the way I thought it had. It had continued, just without me in it. That evening I waited until after dinner to bring it up, because I've learned that how you enter a difficult conversation shapes everything that follows. I was calm. I asked my husband directly. Had he discussed this with his mother and his brother, after I said I wasn't comfortable with it? He didn't deny it. That was something, I suppose. He said he was just exploring options. He said his mother had offered on her own. He hadn't asked her to call. He said he wasn't trying to go around me. He was trying to find a solution. I asked him what exactly needed to be solved, since I hadn't agreed there was a problem to begin with. He went quiet. Then he said the thing I had been waiting without knowing I was waiting for. He said the house had 6 rooms and 2 of them were just sitting there. He said his family needed help. He said what kind of family didn't help when they could. I said, the kind that was never asked permission. He didn't have an answer to that. My mother-in-law arrived the following Saturday. She had not been invited. My husband had told me she was coming to visit, which I understood was different from being invited, though I didn't say that out loud. She arrived with a casserole dish and a rolling suitcase, and she stood in the front hallway and looked at the house the way someone looks at a space they are imagining differently. She walked through the ground floor with the particular energy of a woman who has decided something has already been decided. She looked at the guest room and nodded. She looked at the small study at the end of the hall and said it would make a nice space for her son to work from. She stood in the kitchen and said the layout reminded her of her aunt's house in Timmins. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and she put her hands flat on it and she looked at me with an expression I can only describe as maternal authority, the kind that assumes it will be received as love. She said she wanted to talk about the arrangement. She used that word, arrangement, as though it had already been arranged. I sat across from her and I listened. She talked about family. She talked about how in her family, doors were always open, resources were shared, no one went without when someone else had enough. She talked about my brother-in-law's situation with a softness that made him sound very young and very lost, which was partly true and partly strategic. She talked about how grateful everyone would be. She talked about how I'd barely noticed the difference. Then she said she'd need a copy of the house key, since she'd be coming on weekends, and she didn't want to be a bother by always needing someone to let her in. The kitchen was very quiet. I could hear the old radiator ticking in the hallway. I could hear my husband somewhere at the back of the house, deliberately not present in the room where the conversation was happening. I felt something happen inside me that I don't have a clean word for. Not anger, not panic. Something more like the sudden end of uncertainty. Like when you've been waiting for a diagnosis and it finally comes and the fear you felt while waiting is replaced by something colder and more functional. You know what's happening. You know what to do. I looked at my mother-in-law's hands on the table. I looked at her face, which had the settled expression of a woman who has asked for things her whole life and found that asking usually works. I said, I need to show you something. I got up and went to the study, the same study she had just assessed as suitable for her son. And I opened the top drawer of the oak desk my grandmother had used for 30 years. I kept the property documents there in a blue folder, organized the way my grandmother had organized everything important, clearly, deliberately, with nothing left to interpretation. I brought the folder back to the kitchen table. I opened it and turned it so it faced her. The deed was right on top. My name, my address. Transfer from my grandmother, witnessed and registered with the city of Greater Sudbury, dated February the 14th, 2 years prior. My husband's name did not appear on it. His mother's name did not appear on it. His brother's name did not appear on it. I put my finger on the line with my name and I said, this house belonged to my grandmother. She worked in hospital laundry for 29 years to pay for it. She ate toast for dinner so she could keep the property taxes current. She left it to me because I was there when she needed someone to be there. My name is the only name on this document because this is the only name it was ever meant to have on it. My mother-in-law looked at the document. She looked at it for a long time. I said, I understand that your son is going through a hard time. I genuinely want to help him find a solution. But this house is not the solution, and it was not available to be offered, and I need you to understand that clearly so we don't find ourselves in this conversation again." She looked up from the document. Something had shifted in her face. The settled confidence had gone somewhere, and what replaced it was something I recognized from other moments of significant recalibration, a kind of stillness that comes right before a person reorganizes their understanding of a situation they had misjudged. She said, "Your husband said." I said, "I know what he said. He and I will be having a separate conversation about that." She looked toward the back of the house, where my husband had been quiet for too long. She said, "I didn't realize." I said, "Now you do." She didn't leave with anger. I want to be clear about that because I think it matters. She left with something that I think was genuinely closer to respect, though it took the form of quiet, which is sometimes how respect arrives when it hasn't been practiced. She said goodbye at the door. She hugged me briefly. She drove the 2 hours back to Barrie. My husband came into the kitchen when her car had gone. He stood at the window for a moment, looking at the driveway. Then he turned and he looked at me and he said my name, just that, the way people say your name when they have run out of other things that feel sufficient. I said, "Sit down." He sat. I told him that I loved him. I told him that I had meant that when I said it at our wedding, and I meant it now, and I expected to mean it for a long time to come. But I told him that love had never been the question. The question was whether he understood what I had been given and what I was responsible to protect. I told him about the winter I was 18, when my grandmother drove 4 hours in a January snowstorm to sit with me in emergency after I'd had an allergic reaction, and my parents couldn't get there in time. I told him about the summer I was 22, when she sent me $500 without being asked, because she said she could hear in my voice on the phone that I was one bad week away from giving up on something important. I told him she had not asked for anything in return for any of it, not once, not from anyone, for 43 years. That the house was not an asset. That the house was the material form of everything she had given without accounting for it. I told him that when he discussed options for his family's living situation without telling me, using a home that was not his to propose, he had not simply made a logistical error. He had told me something about how he understood our life together, and I needed him to look at that directly and not away from it. He was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, he said he had told himself it was just exploring options. He said he had told himself I might come around if it was presented the right way. He said he had listened to his mother and his brother describe their need and had let that crowd out the thing he already knew, which was that it wasn't his to offer. He said, "I think I was more afraid of disappointing them than I was of being unfair to you." I said that was an honest thing to say, and I appreciated it. I said it was also exactly the thing we needed to change. We spent the following weeks in a kind of conversation I don't think we'd ever managed before. Not fighting, not negotiating, but actually talking. About how he'd grown up in a family where his mother's requests were understood as requirements. About how I'd grown up watching someone sacrifice quietly and never be fully seen for it. About how those two histories had been living in our marriage, underneath the surface of everything, shaping things we hadn't named. My brother-in-law found a basement suite in Guelph through a coworker. He moved in the following month. My mother-in-law continued to visit every 6 weeks, as she always had. Things between us were careful for a while, the way things are careful after something real has been said out loud. But careful isn't cold, it's just honest. It's just two people acknowledging that something shifted and choosing to move forward from the new position rather than pretend the shift didn't happen. She has never again mentioned a key. My grandmother's house still smells like wood smoke and old wool, and something I still can't name cleanly. In December, the single-pane windows frost over on the inside, and I sit at my grandmother's oak desk, and I can see the pattern of ice forming at the corners of the glass, the same pattern she must have watched for decades, and I think about what it means to hold something. Not to clutch it or to hoard it. Just to hold it. The way you hold something that was placed in your hands by someone who knew you could be trusted with it. The keys are on the same hook by the back door, where she always kept them. That's exactly where they belong.